There is a phrase in the academic literature that does not belong there. It appears in a peer-reviewed study published in the journal Antiquity in 2021, written by archaeologists from the University of Bonn, who spent 52 days surveying 465 hectares of Mongolian steppe with a superconducting quantum interference device, a SQUID, a technology that measures underground magnetic fields and topographic variation to produce maps of what lies beneath the surface without disturbing the ground. They were mapping Karakorum, the capital of the Mongol Empire, the city that once governed more contiguous territory than any political entity in human history. No detailed map of the city had ever been made before. The written accounts of European travelers had been accepted at face value for 700 years. When the archaeologists finally looked beneath the surface, they found a city far more extensive, far more organized, and far more structurally complex than anything the written record had prepared them for. They reached for a phrase to describe what they found. They called Karakorum an implanted city. What they meant precisely was that the city arrived fully formed with no preceding local urban tradition to explain it. It appeared on the steppe as if placed there, detached from the pastoralist society around it, disconnected from any developmental sequence that would account for its sudden size and organization. The phrase was technical, and the archaeologists were careful. They did not mean anything beyond the specific architectural and sociological observation they were making. But the phrase stays with you. The implanted city. Hold it for a moment, and then consider what lies beneath the ice of East Antarctica, 2 kilometers down, where ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed an ancient landscape the size of Slovenia, river valleys, sharply peaked hills, terrain carved by water over an indeterminate span of time, frozen in place, perfectly preserved, untouched since the ice closed over it. Consider what the sediment cores drilled from the Ross Ice Shelf have found. Shell fragments, the remains of marine organisms that require sunlight to survive. Evidence of open ocean where there is now only ice. Evidence, in other words, that someone or something could have been there, could have built there, could have been implanted there at the bottom of the world in a time the standard record does not reach. Perhaps this is coincidence. Perhaps the 2 data points belong in entirely separate conversations. Perhaps the phrase that will not leave is just a phrase, but it arrived fully formed, and it has no obvious origin. The most detailed account of Karakorum that survives from the period of its greatness was written by William of Rubruck, a Flemish Franciscan missionary who arrived at the city in 1254 as an envoy of King Louis IX of France. He left a description that historians accepted for centuries as the definitive account. Rubruck was not impressed. He compared the city unfavorably to the village of Saint-Denis outside Paris and noted that the royal abbey at Saint-Denis was 10 times as magnificent as the Great Khan's palace. But he also described, without appearing to understand the significance of what he was seeing, a walled city with 4 gates facing the 4 cardinal directions, 2 fixed residential quarters, one for Muslim merchants and one for Chinese craftspeople, 12 pagan temples, 2 mosques, a Nestorian Christian church, scribes and translators from a dozen nations, court officials representing the sultanates of India and Rum, a captive Parisian goldsmith named Guillaume Bouchier, who had been taken in Hungary, and at the center of the palace courtyard, a mechanical silver tree designed by Bouchier and constructed of silver and precious metals. Its branches extended into the palace itself. 4 golden serpents were braided around the trunk, silver fruit hung on every limb, and at the top a mechanical angel held a trumpet. When the Khan summoned drinks for his guests, a servant below gave a signal. The mechanical angel raised the trumpet to its lips and sounded, and the serpents' mouths opened and dispensed wine, clarified mare's milk, rice mead, and honey drink into a great silver basin at the tree's base. Rubruck described this as if it were ordinary, as if a fully automated drink-dispensing sculpture of silver, operating through mechanisms he did not explain, in the capital of a nomadic empire that had possessed no permanent cities 20 years earlier, were simply a feature of the courtyard he happened to pass through. The 2021 survey found a city that Rubruck had not described, with road networks, zones of variable occupation density, and structural layers that suggest a settlement far more ancient and complex than the documents acknowledged. The researchers noted that the Orkhon Valley, where Karakorum stands, had already served as the seat of power for the Xiongnu, the Gökturks, and the Uyghur empires across more than 1,000 years before the Mongols arrived. Each of those civilizations chose the same valley and designated it the center of the world. The Gökturks had a word for it. They called it Otuken, the locus of power, the place from which the world is governed. The Mongol Oral Chronicle, The Secret History of the Mongols, the oldest surviving literary work in the Mongolian language, kept hidden from Western scholarship until the 19th century, describes the founding of Karakorum not as construction, but as recognition. Genghis Khan did not build a city. He returned to a valley that had always been understood by every steppe culture that preceded him as the place where authority naturally concentrated. He did not plant the center of the world. He found it. Or perhaps it found him. These two traditions, the European eyewitness account and the Mongolian oral chronicle, agree entirely on the location and diverge significantly on the question of origin. Neither explains why the same valley kept producing the world's dominant empires. Neither explains what was there before the Xiongnu arrived and named it the seat of all power. In 2023, Stuart Jameson at Durham University and his colleagues used Canada's RadarSat satellite system to trace small changes in the surface of the East Antarctic ice sheet, and to map for the first time an ancient landscape buried nearly 2 kilometers below. River valleys and sharply peaked hills, terrain shaped by flowing water, were preserved in their entirety beneath the ice, just as they had been at the moment the ice froze. The team described it as a time capsule. They noted that in their assessment, the landscape had not been exposed since the ice first advanced over East Antarctica, which their analysis suggested occurred at least 34 million years ago. They also noted that they believed other ancient landscapes remained undiscovered beneath the ice. In February of 2026, the international SWAIS-2C research project drilled through 523 meters of ice at Crary Ice Rise on the margin of the West Antarctic ice sheet and extracted a sediment core nearly 230 meters long, containing the longest geological record ever recovered from beneath an ice sheet. The team found shell fragments. They found the remains of marine organisms that require sunlight to survive. The lead researchers described it plainly. There had been open ocean there. The ice had not always been there. There had been, at some point in the past, a beach. This confirmed what earlier sediment work had suggested. The river systems on the Oronteus Finaeus map of 1531, the rivers draining into the sea from an Antarctic coastline drawn by a French mathematician from source maps he did not fully understand, nearly 300 years before the continent was officially sighted, were not imagination. They were, in some meaningful sense, memory. Implanted city. The phrase returns here with a different weight. Not Karakorum specifically, not the Orkhon Valley, but the question it carries. What does it mean for a city to arrive fully formed? What does it mean for a place to be recognized as the center of the world by every civilization that encounters it, without any of those civilizations explaining why? What does it mean to draw a coastline in 1531 from a source you cannot name on a continent you have never seen and have that coastline confirmed by radar 400 years later? Perhaps it means that what the Tartaria mythology is trying to say, imprecisely and sometimes wildly, is something more precise and more unsettling than the mythology knows. Perhaps there was a source. Perhaps the maps that know more than they should, the valleys that keep concentrating power, the mechanical trees in palace courtyards whose mechanisms no one bothered to explain, are all fragments of the same transmission. Knowledge passed forward through copied documents and oral traditions, and the deep memory of places, originating somewhere that is now inaccessible, buried under layers of ice and time and accumulated forgetting. Perhaps the Antarctic landscape under the ice is not the city itself, but the condition that made the city possible, the source from which the knowledge was distributed, the origin point of the cartographic tradition that produced Piri Reis and Arance Fine and Gerard Mercator, the place whose rivers are drawn on maps that should not exist by people who could not have been there. Perhaps the implanted city is not Karakorum at all. Perhaps it is everything. Perhaps every center of power, every valley designated the locus from which the world is governed, every map drawn from sources that have since disappeared, was implanted from the same origin, by the same hand, in a time the record does not reach. All of this might be wrong in ways that are worth saying clearly. The archaeologists who coined the phrase meant something precise and limited by it. Karakorum was unusual in its sudden appearance and its detachment from local urban tradition, but it was built by documented people for documented reasons, using documented labor in a documented decade. The Orkhon Valley's repeated centrality is explained well by geography. It is centrally located within the steppe, supplied by reliable water, sheltered by the Khangai Mountains, blessed with pasture and a relatively moderate climate. Every empire chose it for the same rational reasons. The SWAIS-2C sediment cores span 23 million years of geological record. The open ocean conditions they confirm may date to any number of warming periods across that span, not necessarily to any period within human history. The geophysicists who describe ancient preserved landscapes beneath the ice are describing natural geological processes, not human construction. Nothing in the radar surveys suggests architecture. Nothing in the sediment cores suggests habitation. The convergences in this account are the convergences of a mind that has decided to look for connections and found them, which is what minds do, and which neuroscience has documented thoroughly enough that the phenomenon has its own name. The uncertainty is real. The uncertainty matters, but the uncertainty does not dissolve the phrase, and it does not dissolve the valley, and it does not dissolve the maps. The ruins of Karakorum are still in the Orkhon Valley. They are accessible. The Erden Zu Monastery stands adjacent to them, built in 1585 from the stones of the razed city, which the Ming soldiers destroyed in 1388. Guillaume Bouchier's silver tree is gone. No trace of it remains. The mechanical angel, the golden serpents, the silver basin at the base of the trunk, melted down or lost. The specific mechanisms by which an automated fountain was operating in the center of a 13th century nomadic empire's capital were never recorded and never explained. Eyewitnesses accepted it as simply a feature of the palace courtyard they passed through on their way to an audience with the Khan. Every civilization that has ever called a place the center of the world was right, from inside the world they occupied. The valley did not need to have been implanted by anyone external for it to function as if it had been. The silver tree did not need to have been inherited from a more advanced tradition for it to have worked. Perhaps it was enough to be built, at whatever cost, by people who wanted to be at the center of everything, and who, for a time, were. But the sediment cores are in a laboratory in New Zealand right now. The shell fragments are there. The organisms that required sunlight to live died in a place that is now 500 meters under ice, and their remains traveled up through 230 meters of geological record to reach the hands of people drilling through Antarctic winter at a remote camp 700 kilometers from the nearest station. They found a beach. They found evidence of open water. They found, in other words, the physical residue of a place that was once accessible and is now not. The implanted city. Perhaps it is there. Perhaps the landscape under the ice is exactly what the geologists say it is. 34 million years of preservation, geological process, no trace of human presence, nothing suspicious in the radar returns, nothing in the cores that demands a different interpretation. Perhaps the maps that knew the coastline were lucky, or extrapolating, or copying from cartographers who were guessing in the right direction. But perhaps the phrase the Bonn archaeologists chose for Karakorum, the city that arrived fully formed, detached from any tradition that preceded it, as if placed, is a description of something older than the city, and larger than the valley, and buried deeper than anyone has yet been willing to drill. Not yet. That is the phrase the cartographers used for places they had not seen. The southern land not yet known, the city not yet found, the source not yet reached. They kept drawing it anyway.